Dr. Shane Retty.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's a pleasure to talk to the Christian Churches New Zealand Property Trust Board Empowering Bill 2015. Fundamentally, as has been said, this is a bill that empowers the transfer of property from an old board to a new board. And I thought it might be kind of interesting to maybe look at the first property that the church acquired, give a bit of background to that, and then bring it forward into modern days. In March 2nd, 1844, the first preacher in Wellington came from Scotland, Thomas Jackson actually, and his first converts were Thomas Butler, James Barton, Thomas Margery, Charles Nichol and wife, John Batt and wife, George Taylor, who I'll come back to, and John Griffiths. Now, in 1844, they had no trained ministry. They were all lay people. In fact, they followed the British church's formula, if you like, which had lay people preaching. And so they ministered their faith using borrowed periodicals. And why I mentioned George Taylor was it was very fortuitous that when he came from Yorkshire, he brought a whole lot of British periodicals with him. And subsequently, they then reached out to James Wallace in Nottingham and Alexander Campbell in the USA, who regularly sent theological periodicals for the burgeoning faith to use. A few years later, 1879, the Depression, church actually discontinued, and then they recommenced in 1879 with a total of 13 members. As you'll see over the next 50 years, they actually got to a maximum of 4,900, but I'll come to that. In 1883, here's their first building, here's their first property, Hockton Hall. The land was donated and they paid £350. So here's one of the properties that's being transferred from the old board to the new board, Hockton Hall. After that, they had rapid membership growth. In fact, no more than 2 or 3 years later, they had 25 churches, 1,238 members, and they engaged a full-time evangelist, Edward Lewis. If we could jump 50 years, if you like, I said their highest membership was actually in 1938, where they had 4,962 members in New Zealand. And that brings us through to today, where, as they openly state, their membership is declining a bit, maybe around about 1,800. But I'd like to actually look at some of the achievement of the Churches of Christ as they were known then. Of course, now the Christian churches, they changed their name in 2012. If we look at some of the achievements of this organisation, firstly, they represented the First World Convention of Churches in 1930. Secondly, in 1955, the Churches of Christ became members of the Joint Commission on Church Union, and that had been set up by the Congregational, Methodist, Presbyterian and the Anglican churches. In 1940, they were foundation members of the National Council of Churches in New Zealand and the World Council of Churches. Fourthly, they were they've had members who have been associates in the General Secretary of the National Council of Churches, and some of their members, or one of their members, was an executive director of the Christian World Service. Finally, Mr Speaker, some of their members have also been chaplains and exhibited leadership for a number of groups, including the Bible Society and the Leprosy Mission. In fact, they contributed some of the early missionaries to South Rhodesia in the late 1800s, which was a really good mission. If we look today, Mr Speaker, as has been commented, the initial property was in the names of elders of the congregations. Well, clearly that didn't work in a modern world. So in 1924 at an Eden conference, they formed a board, and all the property has been authorised and held by the Churches of Christ under the Property Act 1929. That brings us to 2013, where they reconfigured, formed a new entity, and a new structure was formed. And it's that structure, that entity, that this Act authorises. So, Mr Speaker, this bill vests property appropriately. It also says there's no breach in fiduciary duty from old to new. It also says there's no cancelling of existing contractual arrangements. And I think, importantly, Mr Speaker, and practically, there's no requirement for retrospective name corrections on any existing instruments. So, Mr Speaker, I think this organisation has had a fine history and foundation in Nelson. I think it's contributed to New Zealand and around the world, and I have no hesitation in recommending this to the House. Thank you.